Hi, I'm Tony. Welcome to So Lounge. Today I'm going to show you how to stitch in the ditch. Now it sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is because what you're actually doing is sewing in a seam that you previously have sewn to attach parts of your garment together. Sounds complicated, but it's really not. Now, I have been working with Simplicity 8133, which is a wrap skirt. When you read the instructions, they have a part that says you're going to stitch in the ditch. They kind of just gloss over how you're supposed to do that. So this is an in-depth segment to show you how to just stitch in the ditch. Regardless of what pattern you're using, it's pretty much the same for any application. Now we're going to be stitching in the ditch to the front part of the waistband, and that's going to be to secure the waist facing to the back of the garment, but we don't want that to show in the front. So stitching in the ditch helps alleviate that problem. So we're here in step 19, and you can look at the diagram and it's kind of showing you what you're supposed to do. We had everything pressed, so that's all pressed to the right direction. And now they want you to go in and baste along this edge because you're securing the facing, which is just a little bit longer than where the seam is. And then when you go back and stitch from the other side, you're going to actually stitch in that seam, which is called stitching in the ditch. So we're not quite there yet, but this is what we're going to be doing with the basting. And I have my needle all threaded and ready to go. I did put a little tiny knot at the very end of the basting because I just don't want it to pull out part of the way through this. So I'm just going to, and basically when you do this, you can feel it. It's a little hard to see, but where you're going to be stitching is going to be just on the other side of this seam. So it's going to be down here. And let me just do a couple of quick stitches. When you're hand basting, you're just going in and out. It's easy to do this with a longer needle. So you can do like 2 at a time. And then let me just do a couple more so we can see them a little bit better from the other side. Now when you flip it over, you can see where we're catching. And that's where we're going to be catching because we're going to go back and stitch here inside the seam. And I'll show you how to do that. So we're back at the sewing machine, and this is going to be the last step to finish the waistband and get everything secure and finished. Now, once you've got your basting stitches in, we're going to line up this little seam that's right between. So there's a little tiny edge in there that if you pull it apart, you can kind of see the stitches from when we attached the waistband to the top of the skirt. That's where we're going to be sewing to stitch in the ditch. Now the instructions said you can use a zipper foot to do this. I can't do it with a zipper foot. So I'm using my regular foot, and I'm going to show you how to do it with a regular foot. In theory, they say that you can do it with a zipper foot as well. I went through a bunch of my vintage sewing books, and they kind of said try out whichever one you like better and go with what works for you. So I'm going to be doing with the regular foot, and I can see it a little bit better and show you a little bit better what's happening. And I'm going to get everything ready. And we are sewing this on a 2.5 stitch. They also, when I went through the books, they said you could do it on a tighter stitch. That makes me a little nervous in case I mess this up and I have to go rip it out. It's very hard to rip out tiny stitches. So I'm just going to leave it on 2.5. That's fine. It's still going to secure everything. If you want to do a smaller stitch, once you feel confident with this technique, go for it. More power to you. This is only the second time I'm doing this. This is not a technique I do regularly, so we're learning together. Isn't that fun? Okay, so let's go in for a closer look. All right, so we're in for a close-up, and as you can see, this is where we're going to be sewing, is in this little crack in here. And we are going to get that lined up with this center mark on the presser foot. So hopefully your presser foot has a center mark. If it doesn't, find the one that does, if this isn't the one you usually sew with. And then we're going to line that all up, and I'm going to go in a little closer. There we go. Let's move this over a tiny bit. Okay. And you can see that we're going to lower it down on top of, and I'm going to pull it a little further because this is a little bulky back here and I don't want to start right there because I'm getting everything lined up. So I'm going to roll my needle down. And then when you start sewing, you're going to be pulling this apart. So you can kind of see there's little stitches. There's extra holes in there because I tested this out with some basting stitches. But we're just going to stitch along this edge, and then once you release the fabric and pull it back, it kind of rolls back over, and so then you won't see it. In theory, that's how it's supposed to work. So when you sew, pull this back. It's kind of a weird sensation to do that while you're sewing, and you're kind of pulling, excuse me, pulling the seam apart as you're stitching. Go slow, take your time. Let's get started. So I'm just going to move my hands a little bit since I'm pulling actively to make this all happen. And it's kind of a weird thing. So just take your time and go slow. And that should be, that's how it's supposed to work. And we'll see how I do. Let me zoom back out. There we go. So I have my skirt. I'm going to lie it flat on my lap just because that'll be a little bit easier to hold everything apart. And now you can see why we basted, because we're holding the back piece down. And I'm just going to keep stitching and hoping for the best. Because like I said, this is not something I regularly do when I finish garments. So we're learning together. And if it's not perfect, that's fine. It's the first time you're doing something. For me, it's only the second. And it's really just learning as you go and figuring things out. So this is, in theory, this is what the instructions say. There's not a lot of detail. There's a little diagram that you're supposed to figure out and hope for the best. So that's what we were doing. So just keep pulling your fabric apart. You can see it's like a little bit easier here. I didn't iron this quite as flat. And then we're just going to continue sewing until we get to the other end. So I'm coming around to the tie, and I'm going to pull the tie off to the top of this and then just go kind of underneath it. And then I'll go back to pulling apart my fabric and the waistband. So now I'm coming down to the other side, the other tab. I'm just going to continue through this and a back stitch. And we're done. So lift your presser foot. Let's cut off those thread tails. So we finished stitching in the ditch, and we're going to come back and like look at the garment. And as you can see here, I was a little bit off. I wasn't quite in the ditch, but then as you move down the waistband, it's much better. Kind of got off right there and looks pretty good through this whole section. So if we go around the waistband, you can see that it's better in some parts. It looks really good through here. You can't see any of the stitching. And if we go back to this part where I messed up, you can kind of see that I didn't have it quite lined up. So it is showing in a couple of places, but that's okay. This is the kind of thing that gets better the more you do it. So just keep practicing. And anytime your pattern tells you to do it, then definitely do it. And then you can see from the back, it's a little bit wonky there. I don't think we had it quite as straight, but it looks neat and tidy from the back. We did catch the back facing like we're supposed to, the whole goal of stitching in the ditch, but then it looks pretty good from the front for the most part. You can't see the stitching. So now you know how to stitch in the ditch. Like I said, this is the second time I've done this. It's not something that I've used a lot. It hasn't called for it in many of the patterns I've used, but since it did call for it in this one, I wanted to take the time to explain how to do it and to show you that it's not quite as hard as it sounds. It just requires some patience, and then, like I said, the more you do it, the better you're going to get. As you could see from the beginning part of the waistband, wasn't great, but then as I progressed down, it got better, kind of got the hang of it. You get used to the pulling apart and having to stay in that stitch line. So just keep practicing and you will get the hang of it. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by So Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions you want and I will get you some answers. I go live in the group on Wednesdays, so check the events for the schedule. Until we meet again, happy sewing!